My holy brothers and sisters, a little bit of a different setup today. Trying to bring some comfort to the world. A little bit of accidental Talmudist by the fireside. Who's with us? Where are you tuning in from? Can you hear me properly? This is a new setup, but I don't think the crackling fire is so loud that it should interrupt our audio, but let me know if there's an issue. Please comment. Let me know what country you're tuning in from, what city, what's on your mind. Remember, every time you comment on one of these videos, it signals to Facebook we're doing something of value and more people will see it. Go even further and share it on your newsfeed. Fantastic. Alave, what a bracha. So let's see, Joe Branson, hello from the Inland Empire. Donna Smith, fantastic to see you. I know you're coming in from North Carolina. I'll try to keep an eye on the comments as we go along. Robin Stewart from Ohio. I see Lawrence Polanetsky has come in. Pauline Michael from Arkansas. I just love what a cross-continental effort this is. For us to be learning Torah together now more than ever. What a blessing, not just for us and the learning that we do, but for the world. The fact that Torah learning is continuing and that we can harness these virtual tools to make it happen. It is beautiful. It contributes to the healing of the world. May we only hear good news. May new developments outpace all of our dread. And we should hear amazing miracles that they found a cure. The tests are everywhere. Whatever we need, it should happen soon. And in the meantime, my dear friends, let us say a prayer right now together that everybody who has contracted corona, everyone who's contracted the coronavirus should have a speedy and complete recovery. And say amen. That the people who've been exposed to it, that they should never develop the disease. And let's say amen. And the people who are hunkering down properly and taking the safety of our whole population seriously. Remember, if we're young, if we feel like we're healthy, if we feel like we're not in the at-risk group, beautiful. But let us not become vectors for bringing the disease to the at-risk groups. We've got to be over serious about that. We should feel a little bit like we're being paranoid and ridiculous. That means we're doing it right. Just avoid all unnecessary contact. Avoid all unnecessary gathering. Don't gather in large groups. You've heard it. It's on the news. You're hearing it in your community leaders. Take it seriously. You should feel like you're overdoing it, and that means you're doing it right. Because the steepness of that curve, of the growth in the cases right now, says to us that even though by our human capacity to understand, well, we haven't heard about anyone we know, nobody in the community has it, it's not that serious. When I hear about more cases, okay, so then maybe I'll take it serious. That kind of information and information processing is death. Terrible. Don't rely on your own logic and reasoning right now. Rely on the numbers. Rely on the science. It's out there. The cases are spreading geometrically. It's an exponential growth curve. And soon we're going to start hearing that everyone around us has it. And it'll be terrible. And the hospitals will be overwhelmed. And there won't be enough respirators. And God forbid, people will die because of it. And the only way that we have to stop that scenario is to take the social distancing over serious, overdo it. Don't leave the house. You need to shop, beautiful, get the food, get out, wash your hands, etc. But just avoid all unnecessary contact. That's what we've got to be doing right now. Okay. We are holding by Shabbos 13, Yud Gimel. We're on page Yud Gimel, page 13 of Tractate Shabbos, the second tractate in the Talmud, the second tractate in our journey of Daf Yomi through the entire Talmud. We are still in chapter 1, and today we're going to complete the third Mishnah and begin the fourth Mishnah in this chapter. So to complete the third, we were looking at some safeguards that the rabbis placed on our activities shortly before Shabbat begins, and even during Shabbat, activities that are not prohibited biblically, but which the rabbis prohibited so that we would not come accidentally, negligently, thoughtlessly to violate the biblical prohibition, which would render us liable to bring a sin offering if we did it inadvertently. If we did it on purpose, that's a much bigger punishment, but we're assuming people don't want to violate Shabbat. It's just that they might come to make that mistake if they engage in these activities. So one of the last of these activities that was discussed in the Mishnah, we were already talking about the topic of reading on Shabbat by the light of a candle or the light of an oil lamp. It is prohibited by the rabbis, even though, of course, it's permitted to sit there and read a book during Shabbat, especially if it's Torah. Of course, that's permitted, but not by the light of a candle or the light of an oil lamp. Why? Because we might come to adjust the wick. We're not thinking about it. It goes down a little bit, and we need to see the book a little bit more carefully. Without even thinking about it, we'll adjust the candle. We might move it closer. Or we might tip the oil lantern a little bit to make it brighter. And that is a biblically prohibited activity. When we adjust the wick of a Shabbos light, we come to allow part of it to burn that might not otherwise. Once we light the candles for Shabbat before Shabbat begins on a Friday afternoon, we do not touch those candles afterward because we would be moving the candle, moving the wick during Shabbat. Along these lines, we have an instruction that the teacher of children may arrange the sections of the Torah verses that he's going to teach the kids, but he can't read the verses, right? So imagine a teacher's getting ready to do a Torah lesson, perhaps the next day, maybe even that night. Like he's just going to teach them. And maybe during the day, he's going to hand out, some books that the kids could read from. And during the day, of course, you can read. There's no problem. It's that you can't read by the light of the oil lamp. By the light of the sun, you certainly can read on Shabbat because you're not going to come to adjust the sun. But so the teacher can arrange the sections for the children, but he can't read the Torah sections that he's going to teach, right? So he can do the kind of rough and ready preparation of, he can just sort of look at the chapter headings, know what books he's going to teach. He can arrange that, but he can't read. Interestingly, kind of counterintuitively, unexpectedly, the rabbis say that the children can read by the light of the candle on Shabbat. Why? We're not afraid that they will come to adjust the candle or adjust the wick in the oil lamp. Why? Because the fear of their teacher is upon them. So some interpret this passage to mean that the children can read, any book, but particularly a Torah book, by the light of a candle on Shabbat in the presence of their teacher. Because in the presence of their teacher, they won't reach out and adjust the candle. They won't reach out and adjust the oil lamp. That's for their teacher to do, right? They're just little kids. They're gonna do what they're told. They're gonna stay with the book. Maybe kids were more respectful of authority in the days of the sages. Now it's hard to imagine that you would just trust that all the kids, because they fear and respect the teacher so much, won't go anywhere near that candle. But some even say that what is told here in the Talmud is that the kids can read by the candle on Shabbat, even in the absence of the teacher, like the teacher's not directly present, because the fear of their teacher, the respect of their teacher, stays with them even when the teacher is not in the room. Would that all of our students would be so impressed and respectful and in awe of their teachers as the children who are referenced here in these passages of the Talmud. Where am I going next? Okay, so while we're discussing these kinds of safeguards, right, so that we don't come to violate Shabbat accidentally, the rabbis digress a little bit on similar kinds of safeguards. Now here we're going to enter a little bit of a delicate area. But it's important to know that the sages are going to have to look at every area of life. I mean, they're going to discuss, we've already seen that. They discuss how we go to the bathroom, how we behave in the bathroom, etc. Likewise, there's going to be discussion of relations between a husband and wife. Okay? So if this kind of talk is too delicate for you, you've had your trigger warning. But of course, in Jewish law, first of all, the only people that are permitted to have relations with each other, conjugal relations, are a husband and wife. No one else can have sex. If they do, it's an aveira, it's a sin. But a husband and wife, even though they are permitted to each other and prohibited to all other people in the world, are also prohibited to each other during certain times. And here we're going to discuss that they're prohibited to each other during the monthly time of the wife, right? So during her menses, she's prohibited while she's having the monthly bleeding. And then once that stops, she's still prohibited to him for another 7 days while she's counting the clean days. She has to be clean for 7 days. After the period has stopped, then she would immerse in the mikvah, and then they're permitted to each other, and in fact it's a big mitzvah and a big blessing that they should come together when she comes home from the immersion in the mikvah. Now we're discussing during the time that they're prohibited to each other. So during that time, they may not, so according to Talmudic law, and this is the halacha, right? So like very observant people follow this punctiliously, they may not share a bed. Now they know they can't touch each other, right? It's not just that they can't have relations, they can't even touch each other, right? She is not permitted to him in any way. They can't even touch, a pinky to a pinky. They can't touch each other. Can they share a bed under a blanket if the two of them are fully clothed, right? I mean, there's no danger that they're gonna come together and do what husbands and wives do because they're fully clothed under the blanket in the marriage bed. And so they analyze this question. And so by way of analogy, they say, look, under the laws of kashrut, we don't have milk and meat together. Right? We don't eat milk and meat together because you don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and that has been extended and understood to mean that you don't eat meat and milk together, period. That really refers to red meat, but the rabbis extended that prohibition to fowl as well, right? So no chicken, no duck, nothing that is like meat can be eaten with milk. So, because you can't eat milk and meat together, you don't put a meat dish and a milk dish on the same table, lest a person come and forget that these two things can't be eaten together. It's like a fence around the Torah for the person who's going to eat. We don't put those two foods on the same table so that they, in a moment of forgetfulness, they eat both foods that are out there on the table. Likewise, we don't let the husband and the wife be in the bed together even with their clothes on. But they challenge this, the sages challenge this and say, well, wait a minute. The person who's going to eat, he could forget and come to eat both the milk and the meat that are before him. But the husband and the wife who are in bed, they have two brains, right? The person who's eating only has one brain, so if he forgets, he'll make a mistake and he could eat both the milk and the meat. But in the bed, the husband has a brain and the wife has a brain. So both would have to forget simultaneously for them to come, and commit the prohibited deed during their time that they're prohibited to each other. So isn't it good enough that there are two consciousnesses in the bed, whereas there's only one at the dining table? Answer, no, not good enough. They could still come to make a mistake. So then the prohibition is challenged by saying, well, wait a minute. Food being on the table, okay, a person could come to forget because it's just food on a table. But the husband and the wife, there's two of them, they both have a brain that would have to forget, and they're so unlikely to forget because they're wearing their clothes in bed. And it is not the normal way of people to go to bed wearing clothes. It seems that in the ancient world there wasn't much in the way of pajamas. People simply took off their clothes and slept in the birthday suit. So since that's the normal way to sleep, and now they've gotten in the bed together wearing their clothing, they're so unlikely to come to forget that they're not permitted to each other, that maybe we don't have to issue that prohibition that they can't share a bed even with their clothes on. Answer from our sages, not good enough. The fact is, people are drawn to each other, and this is why we don't even allow, when the wife is not permitted to the husband, we don't allow them to even pass the salt shaker from one to the other. They don't give a thing from her hand to his hand or vice versa, to just remove all possibility of going astray, of becoming too tempted, of becoming forgetful and neglectful, and going on to violate that very intense biblical prohibition. Now, the effect of this, some people will hear all these prohibitions between a husband and wife, go, wow, that's crazy. I mean, this is so extreme. But, anybody who's following the family purity system will report to you that when the husband and wife take this much care to be apart for what can be, 2 out of every 4 weeks, I mean, depending on the natural cycles and things, but it's like often, people are prohibited to each other almost half the time. Well, then when they come together, what a beautiful thing that is. And, the divorce rate in traditional-minded couples, much, much lower than the national divorce rate. And this is one of the reasons. I mean, every month they have like a celebratory date night because they've been kept apart in such a strict fashion throughout the time of the menses and then counting the clean days afterward. And so we go on actually and provide a few more prohibitions like this to make sure that that guarding against touching doesn't lead to the wrong kind of behavior. And actually now, in a time of coronavirus, these kinds of restrictions on touching start to make so much more sense, right? So just in terms of prohibiting people to touch each other because they could become sexually attracted to each other and lead them in the wrong direction. So somebody who's shomer negia, somebody who is guarding against touching, who is following these laws as they're laid out halakhically, right? So a man will only touch his wife, not just in terms of conjugal relations in the bedroom, etc., but he just won't even shake hands with a woman who's not his wife. Now, there's actually also a prohibition against embarrassing people. So you'll find that very refined and religious people will sort of go out of their way, like a businessman who happens to be very religious. He's out in the world, and he's doing a deal with somebody who's not Jewish, doesn't know these rules exist, and she goes to shake his hand. If he can sort of get out of that situation without embarrassing her, and just by being very honest in what his restrictions are, he'll do that. But if he's in a situation where he would embarrass her, a lot of guys will actually just shake her hand anyway, because it's even worse to embarrass a person. But generally speaking, a man who's following this halakha, this law, so the only person that he would hug or kiss, and touch in that friendly way, other than his wife, would be his mother or his daughter, right? Just even sort of casual touching, he's going to avoid that. But the mother and daughter, he can hug his mom, he can hug his daughter. That's not a problem. Okay, and then a final little saying to sort of help us remember this. So there is, we're not supposed to take vows. We're not supposed to take unnecessary vows. But there is a provision in the Torah for a person who wants to accept upon himself a higher standard of holiness for whatever reason, to, for a period of time, take a vow that he will abstain from wine, right? So from wine. He'll have no wine and no grape product, and he won't cut his hair. That's the law of the Nazir, right? So you've heard of a Nazir. The famous Nazir in the Torah is Samson, right? Samson and Delilah, the man who he became so strong and was undefeatable in battle and sort of saved the Jewish people, even though he was not a religious guy, but his mother dedicated him from birth. his hair was never cut, and he never touched wine, right? So the Nazir is somebody who has taken on a vow that he's not going to drink any wine or benefit from any grape product. He's not going to eat grapes. He's not going to drink grape juice. He's certainly not going to drink wine. And he's not going to cut his hair. So the saying, to help you remember that just avoid situations which could lead you into trouble, is Nazir, go around the vineyard, right? So if you think that somebody is sort of straying a little too close to the edge and it's likely to get them in trouble because their temptation will overcome their good sense or their sense of restraint, so you can say to them, Nazir, go around the vineyard. Okay. And that brings us to a new Mishnah. Now this is an interesting Mishnah because it doesn't actually have laws in it. It just introduces us to a new personality, a new sage that we haven't met before, and this is Hananiah ben Chizkiah. Hananiah ben Chizkiah was a Tana, so he is of the sages that existed and taught before the Mishnah was set down at approximately around 200 of the Common Era. He was quite a bit earlier than that. He actually was a Tana who lived while the Second Temple still stood. He was contemporary with the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. He was a very, very learned sage, and I think he must have been doing pretty well economically too, because the rulings that are discussed in this Mishnah took place when there was a large gathering of sages in his home, on the second floor of his home. But he's known primarily as the sage who rescued the book of Ezekiel, right? So Ezekiel is part of the Bible. But the books that are in the Bible, they were chosen to be in the Bible by our sages. Not every book ended up being in the Bible. There were books that were written with divine inspiration, but that didn't end up in the Bible. So some of those are called the Apocrypha. There's other collections. I think the Apocrypha is a Christian name for a collection, but there are books that were sort of written around the same time in the same way as the books that ended up in the Bible, but they didn't end up in the Bible, okay? So Ezekiel almost had that fate to be omitted from the Bible. Why? There were two reasons why the sages considered omitting the book of Ezekiel from the Bible. Number one, it deals with the workings of the holy chariot, the Merkava, right? So by that, our sages are referring to the mystical tradition within Judaism. And this is understood to be for the initiated few, right? When we're talking about mysticism, like real Jewish mysticism, and this would later come to be known as the Kabbalah, right? And so the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism generally, the idea is that, some people, it's not enough for them to just learn about Torah, teach Torah, pray, and do mitzvahs. Now that should be enough for any Jew. That's why we were sent into this world, right? Is to pray, to learn, and to do the deeds that we've been commanded to do. But some people have a longing for God, for God's self. Some people want to experience a little bit more the holiness of this world, the spirituality of this world, and just experience God's presence more than just talk about it, right? And certainly anybody who's had a genuine spiritual experience, I've told my story many times, the experience that I had when my grandmother died, it was a genuine spiritual experience, it was beyond this world. And many times when people have had such an experience, they have a longing to somehow get back to that place, to get back to having a little bit more of that experience. So for them, there is Kabbalah. It doesn't mean you're going to have that experience every day or every week or every year. But by studying mysticism, you start to develop that almost like that spiritual image, vocabulary, interpretation of dreams that we talked about during Tractate Brachas some weeks ago. It was a little bit of the workings of Jewish mysticism as well. And the more you study this and the more you get into it, there's many lessons that you can learn, and perhaps you will even bring yourself to have such a experience again. Maybe you can help yourself. It's not really in our control. You can't make mystical experiences happen, but sometimes you can put yourself in a place where they're more likely to happen, let us say. And Ezekiel talks very much about the experience of being in heaven, of seeing the heavenly host, of having some kind of a peek behind the veil. And it's in chapter 1 of Ezekiel, like when he describes what his prophecy was like. And the angels who are dancing, jumping around and have their faces constantly rotating. And if you're into mysticism and you read those verses, it's very different than people who are not into mysticism, because you kind of grasp a little bit of the fluidity of the spiritual world. At any rate, the sages were concerned lest people who are not educated and who are just pursuing the rush, right, of mystical experience might short-circuit the process. Because for the sages, yes, it's possible to study mystical experience and perhaps even to help yourself bring it on. But that should only be done by people with a firm foundation in Jewish learning and Jewish practice, lest they lose their minds by going into that mystical realm. And elsewhere in the Talmud, we have the story of 4 sages who entered that realm. Only one of them went in peace and came out in peace. That was Rabbi Akiva. The other 3 had tremendous difficulty. One died, one went insane, and one went bad, became evil. That was Acher. So it's very dangerous to pursue mysticism, and sages were concerned about that. Nevertheless, Ezekiel, of course, was a genuine prophet with a genuine experience, wrote it down, and it ended up being in the Bible thanks to the sage that we're talking about here, whose name was Hananiah ben Chizkiah. But the other thing to understand about Hananiah ben Chizkiah was that he also dealt with the second objection against the book of Ezekiel, which was that it contained passages specifically with relating to the practices in the Holy Temple, the practice of the priests and bringing sacrifices. There are just certain laws in the book of Ezekiel that contradict similar laws in the Torah. And that was a really big problem for the sages, because we're going to put a book in the Bible that contradicts another book in the Bible, and particularly the Torah itself. But it was Hananiah ben Chizkiah who sort of rolled up his sleeves, and they said that he hung out in this attic of his. They sent him up 300 barrels of oil for light and food, and he didn't leave there until he came up with, a way to reconcile every single one of those seeming contradictions between the book of Ezekiel and the Torah. Once his interpretations were released, everyone said, "Oh, okay, there is no contradiction. We just didn't understand it well enough." And that is how the book of Ezekiel was saved and came to be part of the Bible. So there was this gathering of sages in Hananiah ben Chizkiah's attic, and they discussed a bunch of the problems, the irreconcilable differences that had arisen between the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Right. So there were in the previous generation, the 2 big leaders of the Jewish world were Hillel and Shammai. They were the biggest rabbis with the greatest understanding of Torah, and they disagreed on a few things in the Torah, the halakha, how we obey it. And their students continued those disagreements. And of course, that was a big problem because, we don't want to have Jews obeying, following Judaism in one direction and other Jews following it in another. And if they come together, they don't know how to behave. And that became an even bigger problem once the temple fell. And it was really, this portable Judaism as a religion where prayers replaced sacrifice in the temple, that there needed to be one system of halakha, one system of law. And these disagreements between the followers of Shammai and Hillel were really problematic, even while the second temple stood. So some of those differences were reconciled during this one famous session that took place in Hananiah ben Chizkiah's attic. A bunch of leading sages of the period came together. They at length, said, okay, well, here's our differences. What are your reasons for holding this way? What are your reasons for holding that way? Let's really work it out, discuss it till we all understand exactly what the differences are. And then they voted, right? And on that day, in that session, there were 18 matters that were settled according to the view of Beis Shammai, which was unexpected because generally speaking, we follow the views of Beis Hillel. We follow the views of the students, the followers of Hillel, which tend to be more lenient in most areas, not all. Beis Shammai, for example, would allow, if two people were eating at a table, one could eat meat and one could eat dairy, we would allow that. At least we would allow that if the people did not know each other. Right? If they know each other, then they might start talking together and they might go into a lapse of forgetfulness and eat each other's food and come to violate the prohibition against milk and meat. But if they don't know each other, they're very unlikely to do that. So Beis Shammai says we don't have to make an unnecessary restriction. But Beis Hillel say no, we don't allow that to happen. We don't let milk and meat be on the same table at any time. Usually, however, the rulings of Beis Hillel are more lenient and the rulings of Beis Shammai are more stringent. But on this day, and so almost always we follow Beis Hillel. Eventually we'll have a very famous passage on Tractate Eruvin, page 13, which we've taught many times here on Accidental Talmudist, that in most debates we follow the law follows Hillel, Beis Hillel. Why? Because the students of Hillel were easy and forbearing, and they stated the opinions of Beis Shammai, of their opponents, before their own. And Nina and I add, and they must have stated those positions in a way that their opponents would agree, yes, that is my position, right? You only do that if you can state somebody else's position without sarcasm. At any rate, although the law generally follows Hillel, there were 18 matters where it follows Shammai that were settled upon in that session in Hanani ben Hiskiah's attic. What were the 18 matters? They're not listed in this Mishnah, but they are listed in the Gemara, which follows. So there's going to be a bunch of examples that we're going to encounter in the next few days where the law was made according to Shammai. And most of these laws, they're pretty technical. They're not, so much inspiring laws, but they're of the idea that a person, let me see. Well, the example that's given, these are matters of tahara, matters of ritual purity, okay? And specifically that if you have touched, for example, God forbid, a dead body, okay? So that is like probably the biggest emitter of tuma, that's ritual impurity, right? So if you touch a dead body, you can't enter the grounds of the temple in Jerusalem, you can't bring a sacrifice, and you can't touch the tithe that you separate from your crop called teruma, which you're going to give to the Levite and to the priest, right? So the Levite doesn't have land like the other 11 tribes, and the priest, doesn't even have what the Levite has. There's very few priests, and their job is to serve in the temple during 1 or 2 weeks a year. But they need to eat, right? So all the other people in Israel set aside part of their crop. It's a tax that they give to the Levite, and the Levite gives to the priest. And the teruma specifically is for the priest. It's holy food that only the priest can eat. But such food will become disqualified if a person touches it who has touched a dead body. Likewise, teruma is disqualified by touching a Torah scroll, which is kind of interesting, right? There's nothing holier in Judaism than the Torah itself. I mean, if you go to a synagogue, look at the way people treat the Torah. I mean, it has a cover on it, and people will walk up and kiss the Torah or kiss touch it with their prayer shawl, their talit, and then kiss their shawl. I mean, we really honor the Torah because it's the source of all our law and understanding of God and the universe and what our role in this world is. So if the Torah is the holiest thing of all, why would touching the Torah scroll and then touching teruma, or if the Torah scroll itself touched the teruma, why would that impart tuma, ritual impurity? It's very interesting, and the answer is a totally practical consideration, because people would say, okay, the teruma is holy food that I've set aside, it's special, it's going to be for the priest. I can't give it to the priest today, so I'm going to store my teruma, in sort of like the holiest place that I have in this building. What is that? In the same Aron Kodesh, the same sort of holy cabinet where I keep the Torah, right? It made sense in people's mind that they would store the food set aside for the priest alongside the Torah scroll. But because that food was set aside and not being used and not being accessed on a daily basis, mice would come and nibble on the grain that was set aside for the teruma. And while they were nibbling on the teruma, they would also come to nibble on the Torah scroll. And to avoid having the mice nibble on the Torah scroll, we say that the Torah scroll imparts tuma to the teruma so that they should never keep the teruma by the Torah. Never keep the grain set aside for the gift to the priest alongside the Torah scroll. Likewise, we learn that a Torah scroll imparts tuma on a person if he touches the scroll itself with his hand. Why did they do that? It's a little different than the Torah scroll imparting impurity on the grain. Now it imparts impurity on you, yourself. You would become tameh if you touch a Torah scroll, and now you'd have to go through a process of purification before you could enter the grounds of the temple. Why? Because people generally were walking around in the ancient world with dirty hands, and so they shouldn't come to touch a Torah with their dirty hands. We tell them, listen, if you touch the Torah, it's a problem for you. You're going to have to purify yourself. And why are you touching the Torah? Probably because you've been called up for an aliyah, right, to be honored, to fulfill the mitzvah of saying the bracha, the blessing, over the public reading of the Torah. It's a big honor and a big mitzvah, a big merit for you and for your family. It's a time when you can ask the congregation to say a blessing for you and for your family and for their healing and their well-being and your livelihood, etc. But if you touch the Torah scroll with your hand, so then you lose that. You would lose the merit of that mitzvah. The mitzvah won't accrue to you. The merit of the mitzvah will not accrue to you if you touch the Torah scroll with your bare hand. And that is why, if you're in synagogue and you see the Torah being read publicly, you see that they don't touch the Torah. And that's why we have these beautiful metal pointers, often made out of silver, called a yad, a hand. But it's like a little metal, a skinny, beautiful little metal hand that we would use to touch the Torah scroll as we're reading along to make sure that, we don't lose our place during the reading, but we don't touch the Torah scroll with our hands. And that kind of extreme care about touching, it's very interesting. This is my last thought for today. It's the takeaway from our session here, and then I'll check questions. But my takeaway is, for 2,000 years, we said, tuma and tahara, being in a state of purity or impurity, for the most part, it has no practical ramification anymore, except in the case of husbands and wives. That's really the case. There's a couple other little exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the only real issue of tuma and tahara is that a woman is not permitted to her husband during the time of her monthly cycle, and then for 7 clean days afterward, and then she immerses in a mikveh, and then they can touch. And during the period that they're not permitted to each other, no touching whatsoever. So that's what we still have. And we have this idea that a man should only touch his wife and no other woman that is not permitted to him, like his wife, he shouldn't touch her at all. But when the temple stood, then there's, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of laws that have to do with how you can acquire and pass on tuma, ritual impurity. And that you have to be so careful not to let any kind of that, because somebody could touch a dead body, or somebody could touch a filthy creature, which is basically insects, and called a sharets. And if you touch such a filthy creature, then you would become ritually impure. Or if you touched food that was rendered impure by someone else, that could render you impure, render the ability to touch something else and make it impure. Really, there was a vast body of laws about purity and impurity and what you can touch and can't touch, and the consequences of touching such a thing. A huge body of law that we still study, because even though the temple is not standing, we study it. But its important practical ramification was when the temple stood, so that you shouldn't come to stand in the temple courtyard in a state of impurity, and you shouldn't come to eat foods in a state of impurity that could rent, etc. So much of this body of law has been it's beautiful because we're learning God's will. It's beautiful because we're learning Torah. But it wasn't so related to the real world. Today, in a time of COVID-19, which, as we discussed yesterday, the word kavod in Hebrew means honor, giving honor, right, to our Creator. There's been a lack of that, so much so in the world. And now we're learning that, hey, we're not in control. The world is not what we thought it was. We need to be thankful if we're healthy. We need to be thankful if we have our loved ones around us. We need to be thankful for everything in our lives, the good and the bad. We even need to be thankful for this pandemic. We do. We don't understand it, but we need to be thankful for it. And 19, which suggests the 19 blessings of the daily prayer, which we say 3 times a day. That is a way to give kavod to our Creator, to give honor to our Creator. During this period of time, we are so mindful of touching. And suddenly, these laws, which put a fence around our behavior so that we don't come to touch something that we shouldn't touch thoughtlessly, right? These laws, it was just an intellectual, maybe emotional, it was a Torah exercise, it was important. But it was an exercise, it was learning. Now, these are life-saving laws. Having this body of knowledge and understanding that the human is negligent. A person, because he's a human being and not God, and not an angel, and not perfect, and not computers have glitches for sure. But the point is, our sages understood very well. We forget. And particularly when we are in the presence of something that we want, whether it's an article of food, or the desire to scratch my face because I have an itch right there, or the desire, right, to adjust my hat. People touch their heads and faces, their mouth and nose, their neck, all day long without being aware of it. Understanding that if there's something that we shouldn't touch, that telling ourselves don't touch it will not suffice. I will repeat. If there's a thing that you know you should not touch, then you must also know that telling yourself, I will not touch it, is a failing strategy, will not work. And today we understand vitally, practically, I can't say the word. Demonstratably. It is easy to demonstrate that in a time when you can't touch stuff, you need a much better strategy than I won't touch it to make sure that the touching does not happen. We need to build fences around ourselves so that we don't come to touch that which we must not touch, lest we endanger ourselves, our families, and start transmitting this thing down the line, speeding up the transmission, which we're so desperately trying to slow down, which would eventually result, right, in the coronavirus spreading to the people who cannot afford to come into contact with it, right? We're talking about the elderly, people with immune compromised systems, etc. People who have respiratory problems, people with diabetes. To protect them, we need to put a fence around ourselves so we don't touch that which we know we must not touch, and just deciding not to touch it, as our sages have taught us in today's daf, will not do. We need a fence. We need to make fences around ourselves. All right, I know I've repeated myself a few times. Let me check the comments up here. Oh, there were a lot of comments. Okay. But not questions. Okay, great. All right, my friends, fantastic to learn with you. If you know people that you think would enjoy the show, share it with them. If they're not on Facebook, point them to YouTube. AT Daily is on YouTube. You can also find past episodes, all of them archived on our website at accidentaltalmudist.org. If you go to accidentaltalmudist.org, you'll also find a donate button. This is normally the time of our annual fundraiser. We're not calling everybody and asking for money because I know that people have other stuff on their minds, but we want to continue to be able to employ our staff at Accidental Talmudist during this difficult time and to keep putting out this kind of content. So if you appreciate it, we would appreciate if you would support our nonprofit, accidentaltalmudist.org. You can go directly to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org or find it on our website, but the easy link is donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. And what really helps during this time, especially with uncertainty, is to make a recurring monthly donation. That's fantastic. It helps us know that we're going to have the means to pay our staff all year. It's very important. We really appreciate that. It's a huge merit to you because you're not only learning in this classroom, but you're enabling others to learn as well. So think about making a monthly recurring donation at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All the best, my holy brothers and sisters, and may the warmth of the hearth here bring comfort to you and all your loved ones, and may we all stay safe.